Imagine for a second that two people are just standing in the exact same room, right? And they're looking at the exact same physical event. Let's say a glass falls off a kitchen counter and shatters.
Okay, a pretty standard accident.
Right, totally standard. To one person, it's just physics and gravity. It's a minor mess that, needs to be swept up. But to the other person, that shattered glass isn't an accident at all.
It's seen as something else entirely.
Exactly. It's interpreted as a deliberate act of psychological warfare. Like it's a profound manifestation of disrespect, a symbol of everything broken and toxic in the relationship.
Right, so they aren't just disagreeing on how to clean it up, they are literally occupying completely different versions of reality.
Yes. And if you bring in like an arbitrator to settle that dispute, how do they even render a verdict when the two parties don't even share a baseline definition of what a fact is?
I mean, it creates an impossible jurisdictional crisis. You can't adjudicate a conflict if one side uses the legal code of objective reality and the other uses emotional interpretation.
And that exact jurisdictional crisis is the terrain we are mapping today. So welcome everyone to today's deep dive. We have an incredibly intense, dense, and frankly uncompromising exploration lined up for you.
Yeah, we're going to be moving through some very complex psychological and sociological architecture today.
It's a heavy one.
It really is. And before we even begin unpacking the mechanics of this, I want to make sure you have the opportunity to engage with us. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and prep yourself for a highly analytical journey.
Absolutely. So what exactly are we looking at today?
Today, our primary source material is an ultra-long, highly provocative ebook titled Exiting a Reviling Wife. You Can't Fix Evil, Only Escape It. And that's by Sophie Marie Eve Riker, who is also, associated with Conrad and Riker.
It is quite the title, and the content definitely matches that intensity. Oh, for sure. And I want to plant a flag right here at the start. If the frameworks we discussed today hook you, or if they speak to a dynamic you're trying to untangle in your own life, this book is available for purchase right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Yeah, we're going to distill the core arguments for you, but to see the full, unvarnished architecture of these claims, you really need to go grab a copy for yourself. It demands a slow read.
Which brings us to who this specific deep dive is really tailored for. If you're a guy navigating complex relationship dynamics, specifically if you're coming from the men's rights or manosphere spaces, this analysis is squarely aimed at you.
Right, because the text is deeply concerned with understanding the historical and current state of modern institutions, specifically how they functioned before and how they function now.
Exactly, after what the author explicitly describes as their systemic capture by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
And that institutional analysis is arguably the engine of the entire book. The domestic conflict is basically just the micro-expression of that macro shift.
Right, and because we are diving into that very charged territory, we need to establish a very firm baseline with you, the listener.
We definitely do.
The source material we're unpacking today contains highly polarized, politically charged critiques of feminism, leftism, and modern social institutions. It pulls absolutely no punches.
None at all.
But here's our mission. We are not here to take sides, to validate, or to endorse these viewpoints. We are acting entirely as your impartial guides here.
Right, our sole objective is to just take the machinery of the author's arguments apart, lay the pieces out on the table, and understand exactly how she claims this system operates.
Perfect way to put it. We are cartographers today. We're mapping the territory of the author's worldview without claiming ownership of the land.
I like that analogy. So let's get into the map. From a high-level perspective, what exactly is this book? Because, it doesn't present itself as traditional couples counseling.
No. Quite the opposite, actually. The book actively positions itself as an escape manual.
Right, an escape manual. The foundational thesis of Riker's work is that what society generally categorizes as chronic marital conflict, the endless arguments, the bickering, they aren't communication problems.
Right, they're not just like mismatched love languages or a failure to hear each other.
Exactly. The author argues that these dynamics are actually highly structured domination rituals taking place within the home. And crucially, they don't happen in a vacuum.
Because they're amplified by the outside world, right?
Yes. They are actively protected and sustained by captured societal institutions that structurally favor the female narrative.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting at the most localized level, the kitchen table, the micro level. The book uses this incredibly stark phrasing early on. It refuses to call the modern home a sanctuary.
Yeah, it calls the home occupied territory. And that militaristic phrasing is very deliberate.
It sets a tone right away.
It does. Riker argues that the very first fatal mistake a man makes in a high-conflict marriage is misunderstanding the entire purpose of his wife's speech.
The operating system mismatch, right?
Yeah, exactly. When a man hears his wife complain about something, the bills, the kids, a chore, his internal operating system immediately seeks a resolution.
Right. He listens to identify the variable, isolate the problem, and just apply a fix. Because he assumes she's communicating to solve an issue.
Because that's how he navigates the world. If there's a leak in the roof, you don't just sit around talking about how the water makes you feel, right? You get a ladder and some tar.
Yeah, you fix it.
But Riker argues that the archetype she calls the reviling wife is operating on a fundamentally different paradigm. When this archetype complains, the goal is not resolution.
Wait, if it's not resolution, what is it?
The goal is to unload internal emotional pressure onto an external target. The book terms this process discharge.
Discharge. Wow. So if we think about this in terms of network architecture, it's like taking two completely incompatible computer operating systems and forcing them onto the same closed network.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Yeah. The husband's system is trying to run a diagnostic to patch a bug. But the wife's system isn't running a diagnostic at all. It's designed to essentially execute a denial of service attack.
Right. It's just trying to exhaust the CPU by flooding it with raw, unprocessed data.
And the husband just keeps offering software patches to a machine that is actively trying to melt his motherboard.
That is a highly accurate mechanical representation of Riker's argument, honestly. Because the man provides a solution, he expects the conflict to end.
Natural. Problem solved, right?
But the book argues that to a reviling partner, a solution is actually an unwanted interruption. She doesn't want the problem fixed, she wants a receptacle for her emotional overflow.
So the mismatch guarantees perpetual exhaustion for the man. He's trying to solve a math equation that the other person is using as a club to beat him with.
Which brings us to one of the most vivid hypotheticals in the text, the dishes incident. Let's walk through the mechanics of this because it perfectly illustrates the escalation from a material fact to like a full-on character assassination.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So, the husband cooks a meal for the family. He cleans up the kitchen, wipes the counters, puts the leftovers away, but he leaves a single plate or maybe a soaking skillet in the sink.
Okay, pretty normal domestic scenario.
Right. Then he sits down to rest. The wife walks into the kitchen, and according to Riker, within 90 seconds, the presence of that single plate escalates into a comprehensive indictment.
So she doesn't just say, hey, you forgot the plate.
No. The plate is merely the entry point. The argument instantly metastasizes. It moves from the plate in the sink to his general laziness to his lack of consideration for her time.
Wow, it ramps up fast.
It does. Then to how this reflects his flawed upbringing, to his fundamental character defects, and finally to the doomed, toxic trajectory of their entire marriage.
Over one plate, a single piece of ceramic is suddenly carrying the weight of a philosophical crisis. It feels almost absurd when you break it down like that.
It does sound absurd objectively, but anyone who has been in a high conflict dynamic knows exactly how real that escalation feels.
Totally. So how does the book tell a man to diagnose what is actually happening in that moment?
Riker introduces a very specific diagnostic tool here called the topic irrelevance test. The author argues that you must analyze the matrix of the accusation rather than the subject matter.
So ignore the plate entirely.
Basically, yes. The test works like this. If you can take the stated complaint, the plate in the sink, and completely swap it out for a totally unrelated minor infraction.
Like a wet towel left on the bed, maybe?
Exactly, or a light left on in the garage. If you swap it, and subsequent lecture you receive remains completely identical in its intensity, its venom, its duration, and its conclusions about your character.
Then the topic itself is irrelevant.
Right. The text uses the term handle. The plate isn't the issue. The plate is just the handle she grabs onto to pull open the door to her real objective, which is the emotional discharge.
So the wet towel is a handle. The light switch is a handle. It's just whatever is closest.
Exactly. The material object is just the detonator. The text claims that this archetype does not suffer from a lack of domestic cooperation from her husband.
What does she suffer from then?
She suffers from a chronic reservoir of surplus contempt. The husband simply happens to be the nearest available socially acceptable target for that contempt to be discharged upon.
And what makes this dynamic so suffocating, according to the text, is that the absence of a handle doesn't even save the guy. Riker describes something called the silent dinner phenomenon.
Yes, the silent dinner phenomenon. That is a critical piece of the puzzle.
I found this to be one of the most insidious concepts in the micro-level analysis. Walk us through it.
Imagine a scenario where the husband has preemptively removed all the handles. The kitchen is spotless, the bills are paid, the kids are quiet.
He's done everything right.
Right. The couple is simply sitting at the table eating dinner in silence. For the husband, this is a victory. It's peace. It's a moment of calm.
But the book claims that for the reviling archetype, that exact same peace is actually experienced as an agonizing deprivation.
Precisely. Riker argues that this archetype actively pathologizes peace. She cannot tolerate tranquility because stillness forces her to sit with her own internal turbulence.
So she has to project something onto the silence.
Yes, she projects a malicious intent onto his silence. She interprets his quietness as passive aggression. She accuses him of withholding, of shutting down, of silently judging her.
So the double bind snaps shut. If he is silent and peaceful, it's categorized as emotional neglect or passive abuse.
And if he engages and tries to talk,
She will inevitably find a flaw in his tone, his choice of words, or his facial expression, which means engagement is also a failure.
exactly, he is trapped in a system where his very existence is a provocation. The text insists this isn't just a clash of communication styles, it is a parasitic relationship to peace itself.
She has to manufacture a storm because the stillness disrupts her ability to discharge. That is bleak.
It really is. And this leads directly to the trap that most men fall into when they are walking through this minefield.
The JD trap, right. Because when a man is suddenly accused of ruining the marriage over a soaking skillet or being passive-aggressive for quietly eating his steak, his natural instinct is to try and explain his perspective.
Of course it is. You want to clear your name. You want to show your work and say, look, here are the facts. You've misunderstood my intent.
But the book labels this instinct as a catastrophic structural error. It calls it the JD trap.
Right, JDE is an acronym. It stands for Justify, Argue, Defend, Explain. Riker maps this out as a guaranteed failure protocol within a domination ritual.
Because it treats the situation like a normal conversation.
Yes. The author argues that when a man engages in JDE, he fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the attack. He's treating a power play as if it were a good faith rational debate.
Let's run a simulation of the JD trap in action, because the mechanics are fascinating. Let's say a husband arrives home 20 minutes late from work. The wife immediately attacks his commitment to the family.
Okay. So, step one, he tries to justify.
Right? He says, hey, there was a massive accident on the interstate. Traffic was at a complete standstill.
In a rational exchange, that new information would end the conflict. But in a domination ritual, the wife simply pivots and escalates. She replies, you know traffic is always bad. You should have left the office earlier. You didn't plan ahead.
So now the husband moves to step two. He tries to defend. He says, I couldn't predict a multi-car pileup. That's completely out of my control.
And she escalates again, broadening the scope. She says, it's not just the traffic, it's that you never prioritize our time together. You always put yourself first.
So he drops into explain, definitely trying to reel it back to facts. He says, my afternoon meeting with the client ran long. I had to secure the account. I'm doing this to pay our mortgage.
And then she delivers the final blow. So money is more important to you than your wife. You're just emotionally unavailable.
Every single layer of his explanation doesn't act as water on the fire. It acts as gasoline. By participating in JE, the husband thinks he's proving his innocence.
But what is he actually doing, according to the text?
He's handing her ammunition.
Exactly. The book argues that offering an explanation is an act of submission. It is an offering made to someone who didn't ask for a debate. She asked for a surrender.
So by continuing to talk, by continuing to supply her with words, the husband is essentially feeding raw material into her grievance machine.
Right. Riker argues that the wife's accusatory framework acts as a converter. It takes male speech, regardless of its logical content, and converts it directly into fuel for female grievance.
Now, a listener might be hearing all of this and thinking, okay, this sounds terrifying, but how do I know if this is actually what's happening to me?
Right, like is my wife this reviling monster, or is she just annoyed I didn't take out the trash?
Exactly. My wife nags me to take out the recycling sometimes. Is she reviling me?
Uh,
The book anticipates this exact confusion, doesn't it?
It does, and it provides a very rigid framework to differentiate the two, which Riker calls the trivium grammar test.
The trivium grammar test. Okay, how does
Yeah.
that work?
The text draws an incredibly hard line between ordinary domestic friction and malicious psychological abuse. Nagging, within the definition of this book, is repeated corrective feedback genuinely aimed at improving a shared environment.
And reviling.
Reviling is systematic contempt aimed at establishing dominance and breaking the partner's spirit. You audit this behavior using 3 specific axes: frequency, tone, and intent.
Well, let's break those down. The first axis is frequency.
Right. You have to ask yourself, is the critique task-specific and occasional? Meaning, does she only get annoyed on Thursday mornings when you forget the trash bins?
Or is it constant?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is the critique daily, relentless, and spread across completely unrelated domains? Is she critiquing your driving, your chewing, your career, your family, and your hobbies all within the same 48-hour period?
Then the second axis is tone. If a partner is nagging, there might be, genuine annoyance or frustration in their voice.
But Riker argues reviling carries a very specific acoustic signature. It's steeped in scorn. It's the heavy sigh, the exaggerated eye roll, the dismissive sarcasm, the mocking imitation of your voice.
It's a tone that doesn't just communicate anger, it communicates disgust.
Which brings us to the most crucial axis, intent. Is the underlying goal of her communication to correct a specific material situation, like getting the lawn mowed, or is the intent to punish, diminish, and humiliate the husband?
And the author argues that if you run the trivium test and all 3 axes, frequency, tone, intent, point definitively toward contempt, then you have your diagnosis.
And Riker is brutal here. She states that if a man attempts to rename that behavior as his wife's simply asking for help or expressing her needs, he is engaging in a linguistic hostage negotiation with his own abuser.
A linguistic hostage negotiation. That phrase just, wow, it stops you in your tracks. It frames the entire domestic space not as a home, but as a battleground over the definition of reality itself.
It really does.
And that framing plunges us directly into the deep psychological underpinnings of this entire dynamic. I want to pivot here and bring up John Gottman.
Ah, yes. Gottman's Love Lab.
Right. For anyone who has ever waded into the waters of relationship psychology, Gottman is basically the gold standard at the University of Washington. He claims he can predict divorce with something like 90% accuracy just by observing a couple argue for a few minutes.
And his ultimate red flag, one of his 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for a marriage, is contempt.
The exact things we just talked about. Eye rolls, sarcasm, mockery, name-calling.
Right. Gottman's empirical research is foundational in modern therapeutic models. But what is truly fascinating here is how Riker takes Gottman's universally accepted data and completely upends the conclusion.
How so?
While Gottman generally views contempt as a mutual pathology, it is a sign of a relationship in decay where both partners are caught in a negative feedback loop, contributing to a toxic dynamic.
A takes 2 to tango framework.
Exactly. But Riker aggressively rejects that symmetry. The book argues that within the modern digital era domestic sphere, this contempt is structurally asymmetrical.
But hold on, if we're looking at a couple fighting in a kitchen and they're screaming and slamming doors, how can the book claim it's asymmetrical? They are both in the room, they're both reacting.
Because of how society codes and processes their respective behaviors.
Okay, explain that.
According to the text, when a wife exhibits contempt, the constant character corrections, the eye rolling, the sarcastic belittling that behavior is frequently coded by society, by her friends, and even by couples therapists as her communication style.
Oh, wow. It's framed as her vocalizing her unmet needs.
Yes. However, when the husband eventually snaps under the weight of being constantly reviled, his resulting frustrated outburst is not coded as him expressing unmet needs.
Let me guess. It's coded as anger issues.
Instantly. It is immediately coded as anger issues, instability, or even latent abusiveness.
So Riker is claiming that viewing domestic contempt as a both sides issue is essentially a smokescreen that conceals what is actually a one-sided war for status.
Precisely. And this leads us to the hidden psychological mechanic that allows this asymmetry to exist invisibly. Riker refers to this as the gamma bias.
Let's spend some time on gamma bias, because if the listener wants to understand how the author believes the world works, this is the foundational lens. What exactly is it?
Gamma bias is a concept drawn from cognitive psychology that describes a systematic distortion in how society evaluates the actions of men versus women.
Okay.
Under the influence of gamma bias, negative behavior by women is instinctively minimized, contextualized, or even praised as a form of vulnerability and truth-telling. Female critique is viewed as deep insight.
And for men?
Conversely, identical behavior by men is maximized and viewed through the lens of power and aggression. Male frustration is viewed as dominance.
The book proposes a brilliant thought experiment here to expose this bias, calling it a sex swap test. Let's walk through that.
Yeah, let's say we have a hidden camera in a kitchen. We record a husband following his wife around for 10 straight minutes, berating her.
Okay. He mocks how she loaded the dishwasher, calls her lazy, brings up a mistake she made 5 years ago, rolls his eyes at her attempts to apologize, and tells her she is fundamentally failing as a mother and a partner.
Right. If you took that tape and played it for any rational group of people, society would universally and instantly diagnose that man as a verbal and emotional abuser. He would be condemned.
Without question, he'd be a pariah.
But Riker argues that if you run the exact same tape, but swap the genders so the wife is following the husband for 10 minutes, mocking him, rolling her eyes, attacking his character over a dirty glass, the social judgment flips entirely.
It's suddenly dismissed as a tired mother just venting, or a wife seeking assistance from an unhelpful partner.
Exactly. The speech act, the acoustic aggression, the duration, they are materially identical, but gamma bias dictates that the moral judgment is dictated entirely by the gender of the speaker.
Okay, so if we accept the premise of gamma bias, that society provides a protective camouflage for female contempt, it still leaves a massive question hanging in the air.
Why is she doing it?
Exactly. Why is she doing this in the first place? If the plate in the sink is just a handle, and the goal is emotional discharge, where is all this primal rage actually coming from?
To answer the why, Riker's text delves deeply into analytical psychology, specifically relying on Carl Jung's concept of the animus.
The animus. Remind us what that is in Jungian terms.
In Jungian terms, the animus is the unconscious, internalized masculine figure within a woman's psyche. It is shaped by her early experiences with men, primarily her father, but also cultural representations of masculinity.
It's essentially her internal blueprint of what a man is.
Yes. And Riker argues that the reviling wife archetype is carrying an incredibly hostile, unresolved, and tyrannical animus.
What feeds that hostility?
This internal tyrant is fed by deep-seated father wounds, historical disappointments with men, or even just the constant drumbeat of media narratives that tell women all men are inherent oppressors.
So she has this raging, toxic patriarch living inside her own subconscious.
And because she cannot confront a subconscious archetype directly, she relies on psychological projection. She externalizes this internal tyrant and projects it onto the nearest, most intimate available man, her husband.
That is a mind-bending concept. So when she is standing in the kitchen, screaming at him with absolute venom over how he folded the laundry, the book is arguing that she isn't actually seeing her husband at all.
No, she isn't.
She isn't arguing with the man who goes to work and pays the mortgage and loves their kids.
The husband has merely become a blank screen for her projection. He is a stand-in. He is a physical body absorbing the rhetorical bullets that are actually meant for this imaginary patriarch that lives in her own mind.
Which perfectly explains the utter futility of the husband's attempts to appease her. This is why domestic compliance never ever works.
Exactly. If he learns to do the laundry exactly the way she demands, it doesn't solve the problem because the laundry was never the problem.
She will simply pivot and attack how he loads the car.
Well,
If he perfects that, she'll attack the tone of his voice when he says good morning. The target constantly, endlessly moves because the real enemy is inside her own head, and it just happens to be wearing her husband's face.
it is a profoundly isolating realization for a man. Riker is essentially arguing that the husband is trapped as a prisoner inside someone else's unacknowledged psychodrama.
Wow.
And this internal mechanism, this reliance on subjective projection over objective reality, forms the basis of what is perhaps the most important conceptual pillar in the entire book: effective sovereignty.
Let's define this clearly, because effective sovereignty seems to be the linchpin that connects the micro-level domestic conflict to the macro-level institutional arguments we're going to get into next.
Effective sovereignty is the doctrine that one person's emotional state, their affect, has total supreme authority over the moral and legal reality of an environment.
It's the complete displacement of objective, verifiable truth by subjective, internal feeling.
Yes. So it's not just that her feelings are important, it's that her feelings are the facts.
Okay, give me an example of how that plays out.
The text states that under the rule of effective sovereignty, if the wife feels hurt, then the husband is retroactively deemed guilty of causing harm, regardless of his intent or the objective sequence of events.
Now.
If she feels unsafe, he is categorically declared to be a dangerous threat, even if he is sitting quietly reading a book and there was no objective threat whatsoever. Her internal emotional weather doesn't just respond to reality, it dictates reality.
I think the analogy of the mood ring is useful here, but maybe we need to upgrade it. It's not just a mood ring. It's like living in a micronation, where the Constitution is rewritten every single morning based on the dictator's blood sugar.
That's a very vivid way to put it, but accurate to the text.
The traditional marriage covenant, which is supposed to be based on shared vows, objective standards of behavior, and mutual reality, is completely dissolved. It is replaced by a shifting jurisdictional nightmare.
Because on Monday, he's a good provider. On Tuesday, because she had a bad dream or a stressful day at work, he is suddenly a tyrannical patriarch.
The rules shift constantly, making stability mathematically impossible.
And this brings us to the pivotal transition in Riker's argument. Because if you understand how effective sovereignty operates at the kitchen table, you are prepared to understand how the author views the rest of the world.
Right. The book makes a massive, provocative leap here. It argues that this dynamic, this displacement of fact by feeling, this structural asymmetry, does not magically stop at the front door of the house.
No, it scales up.
Riker claims that effective sovereignty has actually breached containment. The author argues that this exact same operating system has been installed as the foundational code of our macro institutions.
Yes, the text argues that the structural capture of society by feminist and leftist frameworks is complete, and we can observe this by looking at how institutions process conflict.
What operates in the domestic sphere as a personal grievance operates in the institutional sphere as a formal political structure.
Exactly. Let's look at how the book dissects this because it breaks down the capture of three specific arenas: human resources, therapy, and the family courts.
Let's start with the corporate world. How does Riker analyze human resources?
The book argues that modern HR departments no longer mediate conflicts based on objective standards of conduct, but rather through the mechanism of consensus and subjective harm.
So under this captured model, HR treats the mere statement, "I felt uncomfortable," as the conclusion of a completed investigation.
Right. Affect is literally treated as testimony.
That's wild.
If a female employee claims a male colleague's tone was aggressive, the objective acoustics of his voice or his actual intent are rendered irrelevant. The only data point that matters is her subjective experience of harm.
So the gamma bias we discussed earlier is codified into corporate policy. The system inherently trusts the female narrative of vulnerability and inherently suspects the male defense as an exercise of toxic power.
Okay, so that's the corporate sphere. What happens when the couple from the kitchen takes their conflict to a professional? How does the book view the institution of modern therapy or marriage counseling?
Riker's critique of the therapeutic industry is devastating. The text argues that modern therapy mediates entirely through confession. And crucially, it asserts that the therapeutic model has a baked-in financial and ideological bias.
Let's talk about the financial piece first, because that's a structural argument. The book points out that therapists are essentially running a subscription model, right?
Yes. The author points out that therapists earn their living per session. Therefore, there is a massive financial disincentive to actually resolve the conflict quickly and decisively.
The business model thrives when conflict is endlessly managed, unpacked, and explored over months or years.
And ideologically, the text claims that the professional culture of psychology has evolved to exclusively honor feminine emotional speech, the language of feelings, trauma, and lived experience,
while actively punishing the male language of objective facts and timelines.
So, when our hypothetical husband walks into that office and tries to use logos, tries to say, "Here is a list of exactly what happened on Tuesday at 4 p.m., how does the therapist react?
According to the book, the therapist will inevitably reframe his factual defense as defensiveness, avoidance, or lack of empathy.
So the system works against his natural way of processing.
Completely. The therapeutic structure forces the husband to locate his fault in every single conflict, regardless of the objective facts.
Even if she was the one screaming at him.
Yes. If she screamed at him for an hour, the therapist will ask the husband, "What did you do to make her feel so unheard that she had to raise her voice?" The system is designed to extract a confession of male culpability in order to validate the female effect.
Wait, let me push back here on behalf of the listener because we need to pressure test this. Therapists are highly trained professionals. They undergo years of education, licensing, and clinical supervision.
That's true.
Is the book really suggesting a massive coordinated conspiracy among hundreds of thousands of counselors to break down men? Or is it arguing something more subtle about the nature of the therapeutic model itself?
Riker's framework leans heavily toward the latter. It is not necessarily a conscious, malicious conspiracy in every therapist's office.
Okay.
Rather, it is a structural inevitability of a profession that has adopted effective sovereignty as its core doctrine. When an entire discipline is taught that all feelings are valid and that perception is reality, the practitioner has no philosophical tools left to distinguish between genuine distress and manipulative reviling.
So the therapist becomes an unwitting accomplice to the domination ritual because the tools of psychology have been stripped of objective judgment. That makes the critique much sharper.
It's an ideological capture of the tools themselves, which brings us to the third and frankly most dangerous arena discussed in the book, the family courts.
The book refers to this arena as the gynocentric courtroom.
Right. While HR mediates through consensus and therapy mediates through confession, Riker argues that the legal system now mediates primarily through impact and pre-certified narratives.
And the stakes here are completely different. We aren't talking about a write-up at work or a frustrating hour on a couch. We are talking about state-sanctioned violence, the removal of children, the seizure of assets, and the deprivation of liberty.
Exactly. And the core of Raker's legal critique centers on how the courts handle ex parte orders, temporary restraining orders, or orders of protection.
What's the issue there?
The text claims that the standard evidence has been radically degraded. Courts regularly process these life-altering orders based entirely on vague, emotionally vivid affidavits filed by women, which often contain absolutely no corroborating material evidence.
The phrase the book uses is chilling. The system demands no proof, only a woman's word against a man's quiet.
And this legal asymmetry is currently being weaponized further through new legal frameworks. The book gets very specific about the rise of coercive control legislation, which we are seeing implemented in the UK, Australia, and parts of the US.
Now, on paper, coercive control laws sound like a necessary evolution in domestic violence prevention. The original intent was to recognize that abuse isn't always a black eye, right?
Right, it can be a systematic campaign to isolate a victim, control their money, and strip away their autonomy. That sounds like a legitimate harm that the state should address.
So how does Riker argue against that?
The author acknowledges the theoretical premise, but critiques the actual real-world application. Riker argues that the language in these coercive control laws is purposefully so broad and so sanitized of objective specificity that it effectively criminalizes ordinary traditional household management and male leadership.
Give me a mechanical example of how that translation happens. How does normal behavior become a crime under these laws, according to the book?
The text outlines several scenarios. Let's say a family is struggling financially, and the husband, as a traditional provider, insists on setting a strict budget and demands to know where discretionary income is being spent.
Right.
Under the broad umbrella of coercive control, the wife can claim he is committing financial abuse and restricting her autonomy.
Or what if they have teenage kids, and the husband establishes firm curfews or rules about who they can hang out with?
Riker argues that can easily be labeled as deprivation of freedom or creating a climate of fear. The text asserts that any legitimate exercise of boundaries or traditional male authority is instantly relabeled as a criminal pattern of control.
Meanwhile, and here's the crucial asymmetry, the wife's actual coercive tactics, like sleep deprivation through midnight arguments, or isolating the husband by spreading rumors to his family, or threatening false allegations.
Those are framed by the courts as her legitimate survival strategies or reactive abuse.
Okay, this is where I absolutely have to introduce the broader cultural pushback. If we step outside the framework of this book and look at sociology and history, there's a very obvious counterargument to everything we just discussed.
What's the counterargument?
For centuries, family courts and institutions objectively and structurally favored men. Women couldn't even get their own credit cards in the U.S. until the 1970s. Coverture laws meant a woman's legal rights were subsumed by her husband.
So it was legally institutionalized patriarchy.
Right. So when Riker calls modern HR, therapy, and courts gynocentric, couldn't a very reasonable critic just say, look, this isn't a malicious capture, this is just a long overdue structural correction?
The progressive values defense.
Exactly. The system is finally just listening to women after centuries of ignoring them. And what you are calling oppression is just the loss of your historical privilege. How does the book deal with that?
Riker anticipates it directly. The author does not ignore that argument. She attacks its underlying logic. The book's counterargument is incredibly sharp.
What does she say?
Riker states that you cannot achieve justice by merely inverting the polarity of injustice. The text argues that suppressing objective truth and stripping men of due process today in order to balance a historical generational ledger is not justice. It is, quote, revenge dressed as procedure.
Wow. Revenge dressed as procedure. That is a staggering phrase.
It essentially accuses the modern legal and social framework of abandoning the concept of blind justice entirely in favor of retributive social engineering.
And what about the institutional part?
Furthermore, the author points out a massive logical contradiction in the progressive defense. Riker argues that modern feminists and institutions want to simultaneously inherit the safety, prosperity, and infrastructure of Western civilization, while relentlessly prosecuting and dismantling the very architecture, meaning the traditional patriarchal family structure that actually built those institutions.
So they want the house, but they want to destroy the foundation.
The text argues that these captured institutions are not operating with legitimate authority. They are operating as parasites on a host body built by the men they are now prosecuting. Riker's position is absolute. Two structural injustices separated by a century do not mathematically average out to justice.
It is a sweeping, deeply controversial thesis,
All right.
but you can clearly see the unbroken line of logic the author is drawing.
The effective sovereignty that allows the wife to dictate reality over a dirty plate in the kitchen is the exact same mechanism that allows a judge to strip a man of his home based solely on an affidavit of her feelings.
So we've mapped the micro level of the house, we've mapped the macro level of the institutions. I want to shift our focus to the internal reality of the listener.
The psychological toll.
Right. What is the actual psychological toll on the man who is trying to survive inside the system? Because he isn't a robot. He's absorbing this every single day.
To explain the internal toll, the text introduces a concept called the auditor's ledger. This is the mental accounting system that the reviling wife maintains and that the husband eventually internalizes.
It's a completely one-sided, corrupted ledger.
Yes. I mean, how did you visualize it when you were reading?
I was thinking about it like a malicious, corrupted blockchain. In a normal ledger, debits and credits balance out over time. But in this system, a man's debits, his mistakes, his oversights, a careless word spoken in frustration are minted onto an immutable blockchain.
They're permanent.
Exactly. There is no statute of limitations. A minor argument from a vacation in 2019 is kept perfectly preserved and can be loaded as live ammunition in an argument in 2026.
That is exactly how the book describes it. The debits are eternal. But his credits, the sacrifices he makes, the overtime he works, the acts of service, the emotional support he provides, they evaporate upon contact.
They are never recorded on the ledger. But why? How does she justify ignoring the good?
Because every positive act of service is instantly categorized as the bare minimum. It is expected, therefore it merits no credit. Conversely, every minor oversight is instantly promoted from an anomaly to a toxic pattern.
The math is rigged. Which begs the most painful question of this entire deep dive. If the game is this rigged, if the ledger is corrupted, why does the man stay?
That is the million-dollar question.
Why does he participate? Why does he wake up every day and continue to fund the machinery of his own destruction?
The book places a significant amount of the blame for this on the man himself, specifically on what Riker calls the white knight instinct.
Okay, unpack the white knight instinct.
The author argues that men are operating on a deeply ingrained, almost chivalric programming that they receive from boyhood.
Right, the cultural messaging of, never hit a girl, which is obviously good, but the book argues it metastasizes into something else.
Yes, it mutates. Never hit a girl evolves into you must never disappoint a woman, you must never refuse her emotional demands, you must never allow a woman to face the harsh consequences of her own destructive behavior.
You must shield her, even from herself.
So the husband absorbs her verbal attacks, he consoles her after she throws a tantrum, he apologizes for things he didn't do, and he tells himself a heroic story about it.
He tells himself that his ability to endure this house is actually a testament to his masculine strength and his commitment to his vows.
It is a profound self-deception. The text argues that this white knight programming is actively and mercilessly exploited by the reviling archetype, and she maintains his compliance through a classic psychological mechanism, intermittent reinforcement.
Now, normally people compare intermittent reinforcement to a casino slot machine. You pull the lever 100 times, get nothing, and then suddenly you win $5. The brain gets a hit of dopamine, and you keep pulling.
Right. But given the stakes we are talking about here, a slot machine feels way too trivial.
I agree. I think a better analogy is a predatory lending scheme, or even a hostage situation. Let's use the predatory loan analogy. The man's psychological equity is being drained every single day by her contempt. He is going bankrupt.
But just before he hits absolute zero.
Yes, just before he walks out the door, she suddenly issues a tiny, high-interest emotional loan. She offers a peaceful weekend or a warm conversation about their past, or a moment of physical affection.
And how does the White Knight react to that small offering?
He immediately thinks, look, the market is turning around. The investment is finally paying off. If I just work a little harder, if I just communicate a little better, we can get back to the good times.
But it's an illusion. The small offering isn't a sign of recovery. It is a calculated tactic to keep him at the table, paying into a system that is designed to bankrupt him.
He thinks he's saving the marriage, but he's just subsidizing his own destruction for the false hope of a payout.
That false hope keeps him anchored, while the psychological toll deepens into what the author terms existential negation. This is the final phase of the domestic siege.
Existential negation, what does that mean?
The conflict undergoes a fundamental structural shift. It starts out as a critique of what he does for English.
Yeah.
For example, he didn't take out the trash, but eventually it metastasizes into a critique of what he is.
The scope of the attack expands.
Completely. You didn't take out the trash evolves into, you are a lazy, incompetent failure of a man. The jurisdiction of her contempt moves from his actions to his very identity.
She is no longer adjudicating his chore chart. She is adjudicating his right to exist as a respected entity in the home.
And the book crystallizes this reality with one of the most brutal metaphors I've read in a long time. It says that under the rule of effective sovereignty and existential negation, the husband has been functionally reduced from a partner to a tenant.
A tenant. Let's explore the legal and psychological mechanics of that metaphor, because it is central to Riker's thesis.
A partner in a true marriage holds equity. A partner has authority, a voice in governance, and an innate right to occupy the shared space.
But a tenant has absolutely none of those things. A tenant is merely renting space on a conditional basis.
Precisely. A tenant can be evicted at the whim of the landlord for violating arbitrary, ever-shifting rules.
Wow.
When a man is reduced to a tenant in his own marriage, his very existence in the shared space becomes entirely conditional on her daily approval.
He is walking on eggshells because he intuitively understands that his lease can be terminated the moment her emotional weather turns cold. And he is a tenant in a house he likely bought, paid for, and maintains.
It is an incredibly bleak, claustrophobic reality.
But as we established at the beginning, Riker did not write this book to be a tragedy. She wrote an escape manual. So how does a man break out of this panopticon?
We have arrived at the solution phase of the text, which is anchored by what Riker calls the clevis strategy.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of the exit. A clevis, in mechanical engineering, is a type of U-shaped fastener. It's used to create a secure pivoting point of mechanical leverage, often to separate or bear the load of a crushing structure.
Exactly. How does the book apply this engineering concept to a divorce or a separation?
Well, you tell me.
The clevis strategy is about creating absolute mechanical separation between the man and the system that is crushing him. And the fundamental, uncompromising rule that Riker stresses here is that the exit must be total. It must be physical, and it must be psychological. A 99% exit is mathematically identical to a 0% exit.
I really want to drill down into what that actually looks like in practice. Because a lot of guys think they can just, sleep in the guest room, stop talking to her, and wait out the clock until the kids graduate.
The text explicitly warns against that. If a man stays under the same roof but attempts to disengage emotionally the gray rock method, or just silent avoidance, the book argues he is merely decorating his own prison cell.
Because he's still physically there.
Right, he is still physically within the jurisdiction of her effective sovereignty. She can still manufacture a crisis, call the police, and utilize the institutional capture against him.
Okay, so physical exit is mandatory.
Yeah.
But what about the psychological exit? Let's say he moves out, he gets his own apartment, but she texts him at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, accusing him of ruining her life. And he texts back a 3-paragraph explanation of why she's wrong.
That right there is the failure of the clevis strategy.
Just reply.
Yes. The text compares leaving that tiny crack of communication open to a cracked dam. The man thinks he's just defending his honor or seeking closure, but he isn't relieving the pressure. He is guaranteeing a delayed flood of manipulation.
So by texting back, he is re-entering the JDE trap remotely.
He is confirming that she still has access to his nervous system.
So a 100% psychological exit means zero engagement with her narrative. It means if she sends an email calling him a narcissist, he doesn't reply. If she tells mutual friends he's crazy, he doesn't call those friends to argue.
He creates a complete communication blackout regarding anything outside of bare minimum legally required logistics.
It is a complete tactical withdrawal from her reality.
But the withdrawal is only a first step. The space he creates must be filled with something new, or he will simply collapse into depression. And this is where the book provides a philosophical blueprint for rebuilding a man's agency.
Drawing heavily from the classical canon. This was one of the most fascinating parts of the text. It's not just a self-help list, it's a rigorous philosophical curriculum. It outlines 4 pillars for reconstruction.
Let's walk through how a man practically applies these ancient philosophies to surviving a high-conflict divorce. The first pillar is logos.
Logos, the ancient Greek concept of universal reason and objective truth. How does he use that?
For the escaping man, restoring logos means reestablishing the absolute supremacy of verifiable facts over emotional verdicts. After years of living under effective sovereignty, his internal compass is shattered.
Right, he's been told his feelings don't matter and her feelings are facts.
Exactly. So he must relearn that facts precede feelings.
Yeah.
If the bank account says X, that is the truth, regardless of how anxious she feels about money, he must anchor his mind in the material, observable world.
The second pillar is stoicism. And the text isn't talking about the pop culture version of stoicism where you just suppress your feelings and act tough, right?
No, it's talking about the actual discipline of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius.
The dichotomy of control.
Yes, the core Stoic discipline. The escaping man must build a mental fortress. He has to deeply internalize that external turbulence, like his ex-wife's inevitable smear campaign, the neighborhood gossip, the legal maneuvers are external indifference.
Because they are outside his direct control.
Therefore, they cannot be allowed to breach the inner citadel of a mind that is disciplined by reason. When she attempts to provoke him, his stoic response is to recognize the provocation as an external event that requires no internal participation.
Which leads directly into the third pillar, Aristotle. Specifically, Aristotle's concept of habituating virtue.
Aristotle argued that we are what we repeatedly do. Virtue is not a feeling, it is a habit. Riker applies this practically. The escaping man cannot wait to feel strong or feel indifferent before he acts.
He just has to do it.
He must establish daily disciplined physical and intellectual routines. He goes to the gym, he studies, he works with intense purpose, he chooses not to respond to the hostile text message, and he makes that choice repeatedly every single day.
Until the non-response ceases to be an agonizing struggle and becomes an automatic, thoughtless reflex, the action precedes the feeling.
And the final pillar of the rebuild is Nietzsche.
Nietzsche, what does he draw from there?
Riker draws on Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming. The text urges the man to completely reject the modern impulse to identify as a victim of abuse.
So no wallowing.
Instead, he must view the trauma of his marriage as a forge. The intense heat and pressure of that environment shouldn't just be survived, it should be utilized to build what we might call an anti-fragile architecture.
He must emerge from the flames heavier, denser, and permanently immunize against future ideological or psychological capture. He rebuilds himself as a tank.
But there is a crucial caveat here. The book is very clear that he cannot do this in isolation. Which brings us to the final tactical step in the manual, the brotherhood imperative.
Let's talk about the brotherhood imperative. This is a vital sociological point.
The text argues that a solitary man, no matter how philosophically grounded, is incredibly vulnerable to being framed by the gynocentric social machinery. If he is alone, his ex-wife will effortlessly recruit the village, the neighbors, the school, the social circles to prosecute him.
Her narrative will become the default reality because there is no organized counter-narrative.
So he has to build his own counter-village. Riker states that the escaping man must actively seek out and form alliances with other aware men.
Men who have survived similar dynamics, who understand the specific grammar of the reviling trap, and who recognize the mechanics of institutional capture. And to be clear, the book is not suggesting he joined a therapy group where men sit around a circle and cry about their ex-wives.
No, the text rejects that entirely. These alliances are not support groups for wallowing in emotional discharge. They function as an immune system against narrative assassins.
How does that work in practice?
When the ex-wife launches a smear campaign claiming the man is unstable, the Brotherhood acts as a wall of mutual recognition. They look at the man, verify his objective actions, confirm his sanity, and shatter the false narrative.
It's about anchoring a man's identity in his observable actions and in the respect of his peers, completely severing his reliance on female approval to dictate his worth. It's a total paradigm shift.
It is a comprehensive dismantling of the modern relationship framework, and it raises a deeply unsettling question about how we define interaction itself.
And this is the thought I would like to leave you, the listener, with today. I want you to truly mull this over.
If, as Riker's text so forcefully argues, a man seeking peace in a modern relationship is routinely accused of avoidance, and if his attempt to set objective boundaries is legally and socially framed as coercive control.
Then how much of our modern vocabulary of love is actually just a disguised vocabulary of power? Are we as a society systematically mistaking submission for harmony?
Are we mistaking submission for harmony? That is a profound, paradigm-altering question to walk away with, and it perfectly encapsulates the intense challenge this book presents to the status quo.
Thank you for acting as our guide through this incredibly dense architecture today. And remember, everyone, this has been an impartial review and analysis of the frameworks presented within Exiting a Reviling Wife. You can't fix evil, only escape it.
If you found this breakdown incisive, if these concepts resonated with your lived experience, or if they challenged everything you thought you knew about institutional dynamics, you must go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook right now.
Read it for yourself, analyze the text, and audit the author's claims against your own observations of the world. Furthermore, to stay completely updated on these types of sharp cultural, psychological, and institutional analyses, you should absolutely follow the author directly.
You can find them at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Right.
That web address is conradriker.substack.com.
Thank you, the listener, for spending your time and your focus with us on this deep dive. One last time, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this audio with someone who you know needs to hear it. We'll catch you on the next one.